Why nobody lives in the center of Australia. There is enough water hidden beneath the center of Australia to fill Sydney Harbour 130,000 times over. And still, almost nobody lives there. Explorers dragged a wooden boat across those same dunes searching for a sea that never existed, until one of them went blind trying to find it. A prospector starved to death chasing gold that was probably never real. Farmers built entire towns past a line one surveyor begged them not to cross, then watched dust swallow every one of them whole. The government even detonated nuclear bombs in that same emptiness, certain no one would ever find out. By the end, you'll know why every attempt to fill this land has failed, and what still lies buried beneath it. Picture this instead of remembering it. Drive for hours out here, and you won't pass another car. Not another fence. Not another sign that anyone else exists. The Outback swallows nearly half the continent, and almost nobody is in it. Anna Creek Station, a single cattle ranch in South Australia, is larger than the entire country of Israel, one property, one owner, and still barely enough grass to feed its herd. Birdsville is the largest town for 500 kilometers in any direction. 500 kilometers. That's the width of a small country, and in all of it, one town, a few hundred people. We assume this emptiness is simple. Heat, dryness, nothing to work with. But water isn't actually the missing piece here. Beneath all that red dirt sits the Great Artesian Basin, the largest underground water system on the planet. The same basin that gives this land the 130,000 harbor figure from the beginning. The water was never the problem. Something else keeps winning. This is a place with everything except a reason to stay. The first sign of a desert that swallows every plan built to fill it. 15 men. 200 sheep. And a boat dragged into the desert on wheels, because Charles Sturt believed the rivers of inland Australia had to be flowing somewhere. In August of 1844, Sturt left Adelaide convinced that all those westward currents fed into a vast, navigable inland sea, so he brought a boat to sail it. He wasn't chasing sand. He was chasing something that never existed. Picture the boat itself. A whaleboat, built for open ocean, hauled instead across cracked red earth on a makeshift carriage, its hull dragging grooves through sand where waves should have been. Men leaned into ropes under a sun that never let up, pulling a vessel that would never once touch water. The boat never touched water. Instead, it was hauled across the Simpson Desert and the Sturt Stony Desert, mile after waterless mile, the wood scraping against rock and sand where there should have been waves. The heat did what heat does to men who refuse to turn back. His second-in-command, James Poole, died of scurvy along the way, weeks from anything resembling help. Sturt kept going anyway. By the time he finally abandoned the search, the desert had taken his eyesight, permanently, the sun collecting its payment for a journey built on a theory that was wrong from the start. We tend to think exploration fails from bad luck, from one wrong turn or one broken wheel. This failed for a simpler reason. The land was never going to give what the plan assumed it had. There was no sea. There never had been. The land had already decided what it would and wouldn't give, the same desert swallowing this plan the same way it would swallow every plan that came after it. 20 tons of gear. A cedar camp table. A Chinese gong. That's what Robert Burke and William Wills brought into the desert in 1860, on an expedition so lavishly funded it lacked only the one thing that mattered, the skills to survive what they were walking into. They reached the Gulf of Carpentaria, becoming the first Europeans to cross the continent from south to north. They turned around. They made it back to their depot at Cooper Creek, and found it empty. Their support team had packed up and left. 9 hours earlier. 9 hours after a journey that had taken months. Try to hold that number in your chest for a second. 9 hours is a single night's sleep. 9 hours is the difference between finding your rescue party still waiting by the fire, and finding only cold ash and a single word carved into a tree. They'd survived the crossing. They hadn't survived the wait. Buried beneath that tree was a cache of food, left behind in case they ever returned, a tree now known simply as the Dig Tree, still standing today. Burke and Wills died of malnutrition not far from where they'd once had every reason to expect rescue. Only one member of their advance party lived. John King. He survived only because the local Yandrawanda people took him in, fed him processed nardo and fish, and kept him alive until a rescue party finally arrived months later. Even the ones who made it there and back couldn't outlast what came after. One more proof of a desert that swallows every plan built to fill it, no matter how well it starts, and no matter how much money is spent trying to beat it. There was a man who tried to warn everyone, and nobody wanted to hear it. In 1865, after a brutal drought, South Australian surveyor George Goiter walked the land himself and drew a line across the map, not a guess, but a warning, built from watching exactly how far the rain actually reached. Beyond that line, he said, you cannot farm here. Not reliably. Not for long. People laughed him off. A run of unusually wet seasons through the 1870s made the desert look generous for a while, and farmers convinced themselves the land had changed, chasing a belief that sounds absurd now but felt like faith then, that the plow itself could summon rain. Whole towns rose past Goiter's warning as if it had never been spoken. Farina. Hammond. Bruce. Real families, real houses, built on a bet against a man who had already done the math. Then the dry years came back. Through the 1880s, and again from 1896 to 1902, drought returned with a vengeance no one had planned for. Dust storms tore through land with no roots left to hold it down, burying fences, burying streets, burying the bet those families had made. Over 1.5 million acres of farmland were abandoned. It turns out the man everyone had laughed at had never been wrong at all. And even the deeper water that survived the farms isn't safe. Near Alice Springs, that same hidden basin is dropping faster than the sky can refill it, year after year, quietly running out beneath a town that still depends on it. Even the water that outlasted the farms is running out, the same desert swallowing every plan to fill it, just more slowly this time. Look at the border between South Australia, Queensland, and New South Wales from orbit, and something strange appears. A hard, unnatural line, cuts straight through thousands of kilometers of red desert. It's the Dingo Fence, longer than the distance from Sydney to Perth and back again, built in the 1880s for one simple purpose: keep dingoes away from sheep country. The fence worked exactly as planned. That was the problem. On the dingo-free side, with the one predator capable of keeping them in check removed entirely, populations of feral cats and foxes exploded. They tore through native marsupial populations that had no defense against them, animals that had evolved alongside dingoes for thousands of years but never learned to survive without them. Without dingoes to thin their numbers either, red kangaroos surged as well, and kept grazing, until the vegetation that once anchored the sand dunes of the Strzaletsky Desert simply wasn't there anymore. The dunes started losing their shape, grain by grain, drifting where they used to hold still. For decades, nobody could prove this from the ground. It took decades of satellite imagery, tracking how much living plant cover actually blanketed the soil, to see the pattern clearly. When they finally mapped it, the fence line appeared exactly where the wire stood. One side stripped and shifting, the other side holding steady. A fence built to protect one industry had, without anyone intending it, reshaped the geomorphology of an entire desert. Even a solution becomes another thing this desert reshapes on its own terms. 3 girls walked along that same kind of fence line in 1931, barefoot, with nothing but the wire itself to guide them home. Molly, Gracie, and Daisy had been taken from their families and placed in a settlement built to forcibly assimilate Aboriginal children, stripping them of language, culture, and connection to country. They escaped. And instead of running blind into open desert, they did something that had never occurred to the men who built these fences to divide the land. They used the fence itself as a map. For weeks they walked along 1,600 kilometers of wire, through terrain that had already killed trained, funded, adult explorers with maps and supplies and boats. Police searched for them on the ground. Planes flew overhead, scanning the dunes. The girls kept walking anyway, following a single unbroken line through country built to disorient anyone without one, sleeping rough, going hungry, and simply continuing. They made it. All 3 of them reached their families in Jigalong, alive, after weeks that should have ended the way every other desert story in this land had ended before. For once, something crossed this desert and made it out the other side, proof that even a place built to swallow every plant can, just this once, be outlasted. Deep in the Woomera prohibited area, a stretch of desert chosen partly because almost nobody would ever see it, Britain detonated 7 major nuclear weapons between 1955 and 1963. Sit with that for a second. A government picked this exact silence, this exact absence of witnesses, on purpose. And that fact alone sounds like the worst of it. It wasn't. Alongside those 7 headline tests, roughly 550 additional experiments, quietly codenamed things like kittens, rats, and vixens, tested how fissile material behaved under fire and pressure. Nobody was watching. That was the point. These smaller trials weren't contained the way the major tests were. It turns out those quiet experiments scattered plutonium across the landscape far more widely than the bombs themselves ever did, an invisible poison settling into ground that people still called home. That contamination fell directly onto the traditional lands of the Maralinga Chirija people, families displaced from country they had lived on for tens of thousands of years. Many suffered serious, lasting health consequences from the exposure, consequences that weren't fully acknowledged for decades. Think about what that displacement actually meant. Not just leaving a place. Leaving a place that held the graves of their ancestors, the song lines that mapped every waterhole they knew how to find, the only country whose rhythms they had ever learned to read. Elders who could name every soak and shelter for hundreds of kilometers were told to walk away from all of it, with no real explanation of why, and no way to know if it would ever be safe to return. Compensation didn't arrive quickly. It came in 1994. 30 years too late for the people who had already paid the real cost. Some of them never went back. The land was still theirs on paper, but not in any way that mattered anymore. A place they had known for tens of thousands of years had become somewhere they were simply told to stay away from. The desert didn't just resist being filled. For a while, it was chosen specifically because nothing was supposed to be there to see what filled it instead. Harold Bell Lassiter told a story that should never have worked. In 1929, he said that decades earlier, alone in the desert near the border of Western Australia and the Northern Territory, he'd stumbled onto a quartz reef 7 miles long, gold sitting in it as thick, in his words, as plums in a pudding. It shouldn't have been enough. And yet, during the depths of the Great Depression, with people desperate enough to believe anything, that story alone was enough to fund a full expedition, vehicles, aircraft, a team combing the desert for a fortune Lassiter swore he could find again. He couldn't. Every time someone pressed him for details, his stories shifted. Eventually, the expedition's own leaders had heard enough. They called him a fraud and left him behind. Lassiter didn't turn back. He walked on alone, convinced the reef was still out there, somewhere just past the next ridge. No support team. No radio. No way for anyone to know if he was alive or dead until someone physically walked out to check. Just one man and a growing silence, days folding into each other in a landscape that gives back no landmarks and no mercy. Weeks passed. Then months. A bushman named Bob Buck finally found what was left of him, his body, and beside it, his diary, both half buried in drifting sand. He had starved to death chasing something no one else had ever seen. And here is the detail that changes everything. Records place Lassiter in a reform school in Victoria in the exact year he claimed to have found that reef, alone, in a desert hundreds of kilometers away. He couldn't have been in both places. Which means the gold he died for may never have existed at all. Some plants in this land die of drought. Some die of dust. His died of a story that might have been a lie from the very first word. And the strangest part of this land isn't buried in the ground at all. Every so often, after rare monsoonal floods travel for months down the Channel Country, the vast salt crust of Katy Thanda, lake air begins to fill. And almost the moment it does, flocks of pelicans, banded stilts, and cormorants arrive to breed, birds that were sitting on the coast, hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away, with no visible way of knowing the lake was filling at all. No radio signal reaches them. No line of sight connects them to this lake. Just an empty salt pan somewhere out in the desert, suddenly worth flying toward, and somehow, they already know. Nobody has ever explained how. Right now, somewhere over that same red emptiness, there may be birds in the air, already flying toward water that hasn't arrived yet. No one told them to go. No one will ever be able to ask them how they knew. There is no signal to trace, no sound to record, no scent that could possibly carry that far. And still, generation after generation, they come. They arrive within days of each other, sometimes within hours, converging from every direction onto a lake that spent decades as nothing but cracked white salt. They are simply already on their way, and by the time anyone looks up to check, they'll already be there, circling water that, from where they started, technically shouldn't exist yet at all. That water hidden beneath the surface, the same reserve that opened this story, is still down there right now. It never was the reason this land stayed empty. Explorers lost their sight to a sea that didn't exist. A gold seeker died for a reef that may never have been real. Farmers proved a quiet, laughed at surveyor right by ignoring him into ruin. A fence built to save one industry quietly reshaped an entire desert from below. A government buried a secret in ground it assumed no one would ever check. And still, 3 children once walked out of the same desert alive, using the one thing meant to divide the land to find their way home instead. The center of Australia isn't empty by accident. It's empty because it has outweighed everyone who assumed they understood it, every explorer, every farmer, every government that thought this land could be measured, mapped, and finally claimed. And somewhere above it, right now, birds are already flying toward a lake that hasn't finished filling, carrying an answer no one has ever managed to take from them. If you're the kind of person who wants to know what's actually sitting underneath the empty spaces on a map, this is the channel for that. Every video here digs past the obvious explanation to find the buried system, the ignored warning, or the secret nobody was supposed to find. If that's what you're after, sticking around means more of exactly this. Next, we're going back underground, into the Great Artesian Basin itself, and what happens to the towns depending on it as it quietly runs out. If you've got a theory on how those birds know a lake hundreds of kilometers away is filling before anyone tells them, leave it in the comments below.